Hi, I'm Alice. This is episode 2 of Olympics Obsessed. Last week we covered the precursor games to our modern Olympiad. And this week we're going to be looking at the very first games of the modern Olympic movement. The 1896 games that happened in Athens, Greece. So this podcast isn't just going to be me running chronologically through each games and kind of highlighting them, but I thought it was important to kind of get a grounding, to baseline ourselves by talking about the precursor games, which we did last week, and now moving on to the very first games, because even though they are the start of the modern Olympics, they are nothing like we're used to seeing and calling Olympic. Where we left it last week, the IOC had been created and they had planned the first two games, with the first one due to take place in Athens in 1896. The games of the first Olympiad took place from the 6th to the 15th of April 1896. This is quite rare in some of the earlier games. The games would be spread out across multiple different competitions and would take place over months, the location being the only thing that was kind of tying them together. Athens is the capital of Greece and its largest city, situated on the coast of the Mediterranean. It's one of the oldest cities in the world, being the second oldest in Europe. Although Athens is not where the ancient Olympics took place, the ancient Olympics were held in Olympia. A bit about the state of the world in 1896. So the nearest I could find was an estimate in about 1900, where there are around 57 to 77 countries, depending on who you're letting count the countries. Now in 2023, it's pretty commonly agreed there are around 196 countries. And so this difference from possibly 57 to 196 is reflected in the number of countries that we saw compete. In Tokyo, we had 206 nations competing. Athens 1896 had 14 nations. However, this was still very impressive at the time, as it was the largest international participation of any sporting event to that date. The first aeroplane would be flown in 1903, 7 years later, so everyone who was travelling to the Games had to travel by train, by boat, or even in some cases by foot. Another difference between these Games and the most recent are obviously that only male athletes were allowed to compete. Pierre de Coubertin, who we met in the last episode, the founder of the modern Olympics, said that allowing women to compete was impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and incorrect, which isn't really the inclusive message that the Olympics tries to embody now. I've stated that 14 countries competed at the Games. However, this number is contested and is probably our first Olympic controversy. I think I might have to get a jingle because the number of controversies in the Olympics, it has its own Wikipedia page, honestly. So 14 countries, but that is if we count Chile as having competed at the Games. The Chilean Olympic Committee claim that they competed, saying that Luis Subercaseaux competed in the 100, 400 and 800 metre running races. However, some historians dispute this claim, and the IOC don't list him as a participant. They list him as a non-starter for the 100 and 800 metres, and they don't list him at all for the 400 metres. Apparently he would have been 13 years old in 1896, so I don't know if that makes it more or less likely that he would have been competing, considering there weren't very strict entry rules on any of the events, so that doesn't rule him out. He has a memorial outside the Chilean Olympic Museum as their first athlete to compete at the Games. But I think even though he might or might not have competed in the Olympics, he was still incredibly successful. becoming the Chilean ambassador to Peru, Spain, and the Vatican throughout his life. Looking at the athletes in general, the majority came from Greece, unsurprisingly. We talked about how difficult it was to travel to the Games. So out of the approximately 241 competitors, 169 of those were Greek. In addition to the travel, we have to remember that we're used to athletes training their entire lives for the opportunity to compete at these Games. And that really wasn't the case in 1896. While there were a few pro athletes, which we will get into later, the amateur versus pro, Olympic, it's a whole bag of worms. Is bag of worms the right term? It's a bag of worms. We'll go with that. Most of the athletes who decided to compete in 1896 tended to just be vaguely sporty people who happened to be in Athens at the time. We had people who were on holiday. A lot of the British competitors were stationed at the British Embassy in Athens at the time and just decided to have a go. This is the equivalent of basically going on holiday and coming back with a gold Olympic medal as a souvenir. Now that we've set the scene, let's get into the sports that were on offer at the Games. There are a total of 43 events, and amazingly, all of the events on offer are still competed to this day in the Olympics. Sometimes the details might have changed, but the overarching titles of the events are still competed. Starting with the athletics, we had running races including the 100, 400, 800 and 1,500 metres. We also had the 110 metre hurdles. The field events consisted of the long jump, triple jump, high jump, pole vault, shot put and discus. And outside the stadium, a very special type of race was run for the very first time, the marathon. Very few of the top competitors at the time were at the event, and the running track had very tight corners. The track was incredibly skinny, if that makes sense, and this made running world records virtually impossible. The athletics gave us the very first Olympic champion, James Connolly from the United States in the triple jump competition. And James didn't just win, he completely destroyed the field, jumping more than 1 metre more than his closest competitor, with a final jump of 13.71 metres. James would also place second in the high jump and third in the long jump. At the time, he was a Harvard student, having to withdraw from his studies to go to the Olympics after being denied a leave of absence by Harvard. He arrived into Naples, where he was then robbed, losing his ticket onward to Athens. He retrieved it by chasing after the robbers. And I would say if there's anyone you don't want to steal from, someone who does athletics at an Olympic level would be pretty high up. Probably boxing would be also quite high up on that list. Connolly would come back at the next Olympics to try and defend his triple jump title, but it wasn't to be. This isn't seen very often in the early Olympics, people coming and defending their title. For the first few Olympics, it tended to be a completely different field to the previous year, but although he tried his best, he was unable to defend his title. He would also come back to the Games as a correspondent for Collier's magazine, and writing in general would become his career. He specialised in writing sea stories, living aboard many different types of boats throughout his life. In total, he wrote 200 short stories and 25 novels. Moving across to the track, Thomas Burke, also from the States, won both the 100 and 400 metres, a feat that has yet to be repeated at any other Olympic Games. Burke used the crouch start, which we're very familiar with now, and it's how every single sprinter starts their race. However, it was very uncommon at the time, and the crowd were quite confused as to what he was doing. But it got him the gold, so I would say that's quite a glowing endorsement of the technique. His best time in the 100 metres was 11.8 seconds in the preliminary heat. Burke would later go on to become a lawyer and a part-time journalist for the Boston Journal and Boston Post. After the outbreak of World War I, he was commissioned as a first lieutenant, and at age 43 was the oldest man in the US military to earn his aviator's wings. Don't you just hate overachievers? I don't think anyone needs to be the 100-meter gold medalist, a lawyer, and a pilot. Please just pick one of them. Pick one hobby. The throwing events were dominated by one man, Robert Garrett. Garrett was used to shot put, so it was unsurprising when he got gold with a throw of 11.22 metres. He had never thrown a discus before, so back in America he had had a practice one made. The practice discus weighed around 6 times the weight of the actual discus used at the competition, so on attempting to practice with it, he had essentially written off any chance of him getting a medal. However, when he arrived into Greece and discovered that he had been practicing with a discus completely the wrong weight, he decided to compete just for a bit of fun. However, surprising and upsetting the Greeks, who had assumed they would triumph, he would go on to win gold. In addition to his 2 golds, he would also win 2 silvers in the long jump and the high jump. Now onto the event that was one of the highlights of the Games, the marathon foot race. This was the first time that this type of race had been run in any type of international competition, and only really the second time it had been run at all. The race is based on the legend of Phidippides. Phidippides is based on the legend of Phidippides, a soldier that completed a 2-day run to seek Spartan help against the Persians at the Battle of Marathon. He ran from Marathon, which is a city, to Athens days later to announce the victory, ultimately dying as a result of this run. It does seem a little bit sadistic to design a race around a feat that someone died performing. What kind of person could think of this? Well, a friend of our old mate Pierre de Coubertin, of course. This is a guy named Michel Briel, and along with designing really tough races, he also coined the term semantics. Just a fun fact there. Now, the Greek crowds were desperate for a win, especially in a race based on the exploits of a famous Greek. Even going so far as to stage a selection race a few months earlier, and considering the lack of effort that was being put into team selections for other nations, this boded really well for the Greeks having a good chance to come away with the gold. The race would start in Marathon and be run to Athens. As this was the first such event to be run, many of the runners seemed, for lack of a better word, unprepared for this event. 17 runners lined up, 13 from Greece, but only 9 in total would complete the course. The Greek crowd were delighted when Spiridon Louis, a local water carrier, crossed the line in 2 hours, 58 minutes and 50 seconds, securing Greece's first gold medal and the first marathon gold. Louis, however, did not decide to run straight through the course, instead taking a pit stop in the town of Pikami to have a glass of wine or a glass of cognac. Accounts differ on what particular type of alcohol he was drinking in the middle of this grueling road race. This allowed the Australian Edwin Flack, after winning the 800 and 1500, to take the lead. And now, although Edwin may have dominated on the track, he wasn't used to running really long distances. He took the lead around 30 kilometres, but after around 4 to 8 kilometres further, he collapsed. A Greek spectator ran to his aid and helped him, but as he came round, he punched the spectator, flooring him. He was therefore removed from the race, and he was tended to by Prince Nicholas of Greece and Denmark. I'm quite amazed that the prince would want to get that close to him after he's just punched someone, but each to their own, I guess. And this wasn't the only royal involvement in the marathon. When Louis entered the stadium to complete the final lap and win the race, he was joined on that final lap by Crown Prince Constantine and Prince George of Greece. The excitement of the Greek crowd would only increase as the next two runners across the line were Greek as well. However, there was an issue with the third place finisher. Spiridon Bekalos was later disqualified, and his disqualification is possibly one of the weirdest in Olympic history. He was found to have covered part of the marathon course by carriage. And amazingly, this won't be the last time in Olympic history that we see someone decide to hop in a vehicle for part of the marathon. This meant that the bronze medal was then given to Gyula Kellner of Hungary. I mentioned earlier that no women were allowed to compete in these Olympics. Thanks, Pierre, for that. However, there was a woman who tried to compete. Stamata Revithi tried to apply to run in the marathon but was rejected. The day the official marathon event ran, Stamata ran the course and completed it in approximately 5 hours and 30 minutes, finding witnesses at key points along the course to verify the time. The officials refused to recognise this time, however, and she is not listed as a finisher of the Olympic marathon. The first official woman, which sounds very odd to say, but the first officially recorded time for a woman to complete a marathon was Violet Percy in 1926, and the women's marathon won't be added to the Olympics until 1984. Now let's go over to cycling. The road race was held on the 12th of April, with a course that was 87 kilometres long. For context, the Tokyo 2020 road race was 234 kilometres. However, if you've ever seen a picture of a bike from 1896, I think you can forgive them for not doing the full 200 kilometres. The bikes look like they're going to collapse if you breathe on them. The Greeks were hopeful again, with Aristis Konstantinis taking the lead by the halfway point. But his bike broke, allowing another competitor to pass him. However, a series of falls by other cyclists would allow him to get back to the front and win. See what I mean? The main issue in the past was staying on the bike and the bike staying under you. If you could accomplish those two things, you had a pretty good chance of doing okay in the event. On the cycling track, the Frenchman Paul Masson cleaned up, winning the time trial, 2 kilometres and 10 kilometres. This was helped by two Greek riders colliding with each other in the 10 kilometres. After the Olympics, Paul Masson would go on to become a professional cyclist, excluding him from competing at future Olympic events. He also changed his name to Paul Nasson, reversing his surname, I guess to distinguish from his amateur to pro career. Another Frenchman would triumph in the 100-kilometre race. This required 300 circuits of the track. It took the winner, Leon Fleming, 3 hours and 8 minutes. There was only one other competitor to finish, finishing 11 laps behind Leon. The last cycling event was the 12-hour race, the only Olympic race that has ever been based on a set time rather than a distance, with the aim to complete the most laps within the 12-hour time limit. 7 athletes began the race, with only 2 finishing. Austrian Adolf Schmau won the race by 1 lap, having lapped the field early on, then cycling side by side with his competition for the rest of the time. And this would be the only medal for Austria in cycling until Tokyo 2020, when Anna Kaisenhofer won the women's road race. In the fencing, France triumphed in the foil, winning both the gold and the silver. The Greeks triumphed in the sabre, again winning gold and silver. There was an additional competition at this Games, this being the only event at these Games specifically for professional athletes. This competition was titled the Masters Foil, contested only between two professional fencers, eventually won by Leonidas Pyrgos. It's a bit contentious, as obviously there were only two competitors, both pros, when the Olympics is meant to be very specifically for amateurs, so people who haven't been paid to compete. However, the IOC do acknowledge this as an Olympic competition and list both of the entrants as medal winners. There were 8 golds in the gymnastics, including events that are still run today: the vault, pommel horse, rings, parallel bars, and high bar, which were won by Germany, Switzerland, Greece, Germany, and Germany, respectively. There was one event, however, that is no longer contested: the rope climb, where athletes had to climb to the top of a 14-metre suspended rope, being judged on both time to climb the rope and style. Those who didn't reach the top were ranked based on distance completed. There were also 2 gymnastic team events on the parallel and horizontal bar. There didn't seem to be a limit on the size of teams, with the second-placed Greek team having over 30 members. There's little description of how judging worked. I like to think that they all had to be on the bar at the same time, 30 Greek men, just trying to swing around on a high bar. However it worked, Germany would win both of these team finals. The home team, Greece, would do well in the shooting events, winning the 200-metre military rifle, 300-metre free rifle 3 positions, and the 25-metre rapid pistol. The American Payne brothers won the other golds, John triumphing over his younger brother in the 25-metre military pistol, with Sumner Payne coming in second. Sumner would win gold in the 30-metre free pistol, with John not competing so as to avoid embarrassing the Greek hosts, as in the earlier competitions they had outshot the other competitors convincingly. The brothers became the first siblings to finish first and second in an Olympic competition, and the first related pair to both become Olympic champions. A fun story about Sumner Payne, well, not that fun, but in 1901, Sumner Payne went home to find his wife in bed with his daughter's music teacher. To ward him away from the house, he fired 4 shots at him, missing him though each time. He was briefly jailed and charged with assault. However, the police then realised who he was and accepted that he must have missed on purpose, as he was too good a shot to have missed him by accident. He was therefore released. Swimming events at the Olympics were held on open water in the Bay of Zia. The contestants would be brought out to the set distance to swim by boat and then would have to swim to the shore. The conditions were less than ideal, with the water temperature around 13 degrees and with 4-metre high waves at points. The Hungarian Alfred Hajos beat the Austrian Otto Hirschmann by 1 body length. In the 100-metre freestyle, Hajos was an architecture student at the same time, and like Connolly had with Harvard, he also had difficulty obtaining permission to miss classes to compete at the Games. However, I think that the fact that he came away with not 1 but 2 gold medals, also winning the 1,200-metre swim, pretty much makes up for any ill will that his university might have had for him. The 500-metre race was won by Paul Neumann of Austria, becoming the first Austrian gold medal. He would go on to set world records for swimming at the 2, 3, 4, and 5 mile marks. The final swimming contest was restricted to only sailors of the Greek Royal Navy. Unsurprisingly, the contest was won by Greece. On the tennis courts, Great Britain would earn gold in the men's singles, with John Boland. John is born in Ireland and would go on to serve as a Member of Parliament in the House of Commons as a member of the Irish Parliamentary Party, so it's quite possible that medal should be attributed to Ireland instead of Great Britain. John would also win the men's double competition, and this is the first time that we have to talk about a mixed team, as in the early Olympics it was possible for athletes from different countries to compete together for team events. John, for example, would team up with Friedrich Traun of Germany. When categorising these medals, the IOC lists them as belonging to the Mixed Team Olympic Committee, essentially. So instead of attributing gold to both the British Olympic Committee and the German Olympic Committee, it's listed as a mixed team medal. And we'll see this a lot as we discuss the early Olympic Games. Weightlifting was a little bit different to how we run it at the Olympics. It consisted of a one-hand lift and a two-hand lift. This would be the only time that we are going to see a one-hand lift at any Olympics. In this competition format, the lifters would have to lift a weight with one hand and then the same weight in the other. Launceston Elliott from the United Kingdom would win this event, becoming their first gold medalist. Launceston lifted 71 kilograms in one hand for both of his hands, which is ridiculous weight. If there's one thing I ask you to look up listening to this episode, it's a picture of Launceston Elliott. In the two-hand weightlifting competition held earlier in the Games, Viggo Jensen from Denmark and Launceston Elliott lifted the same weight of 111.5 kilograms. It was decided then to judge the lifts by style, with Prince George of Greece getting to make the decision to give the win to the Dane. The British delegation lodged a protest at this decision, giving the lifters additional chances to improve on their weight, but after neither could improve, the win was awarded to Viggo. Wrestling was another competition that featured, with Schumann of Germany winning gold, bringing his total for the Games to 4 after also being part of the winning parallel bars and horizontal bars competitions and also winning the vault. The wrestling final went on for 40 minutes until it became too dark to continue, so the contest was then finished the next day. I can't imagine watching the fierceness of some of the wrestling competitions, that going on for 40 minutes. Nowadays, I can't remember exactly, but it tends to be around 4 minutes of set time, and then if there's a tie, it will go into additional time. So 40 minutes is insane. There was meant to be another set of events run at the 1896 Games. This was sailing. However, this event wasn't run. The English report states that the regatta could not take place because some special boat's embarkation had not been provided for. The rowing was then also cancelled, with the English report stating the regatta was therefore postponed to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In the afternoon, however, the storm was still on the increase. Some of the lighter embarkations were thrown on the shore by the violence of the waves, and the elements continued to rage with such fury that every idea of a boat race had to be given up, which is essentially fancy old English for it was really bad weather, and so we cancelled it. So now on to the final medal count of the Games. And I have to admit, I have kind of been lying to you this whole episode, because I've been talking about gold medalists. However, at the first ever Games, the winner of each event received a silver medal, with the runners-up receiving nothing. The IOC, the International Olympic Committee, have since gone in retroactively assigning gold, silver and bronze where appropriate. There are cases, however, where the third place was not recorded, or there weren't enough finishers to fill up the 3 medal places. Using the retroactively awarded medals, the United States topped the medal count, winning 11 golds and a total of 20 medals. The hosts, Greece, won the most medals overall, with 47, 10 of those being gold. The Games were deemed to be a success, with the next Games organised for 4 years later in Paris. The Greek officials and public were so enthusiastic about the Games that they believed the Olympics should be held in Athens every time. And this would lead to something called the Intercalculated Games, which I will have to talk about another time. The Olympics, in fact, wouldn't return to Athens officially until 2004, 108 years later. I really hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the Athens 1896 Games. If you have enjoyed the episode, I'd love if you could leave a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. And you can also follow all of my Olympics Obsessed socials. So I have a TikTok where I tend to post videos about recent Olympic news and also some historical pictures or pictures and content that relate to podcast episodes. So you can find all of those in the description below, or you can just search Olympics Obsessed. I hope you guys will join me next week, where I'm planning to go into a little bit more detail about the first gold medals of some of the countries that we have and haven't mentioned in this first episode. Thank you guys for joining me, and I'll see you next week.